The morning sun painted the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Lutheran Church in warm colors as people slowly filled the wooden pews. It was just another Sunday in Cedar Ridge, Montana, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The church bell had finished its familiar call, and folks were settling in for Pastor Williams' weekly sermon. In the third row from the front, right side, sat Margaret Hayes. She occupied the same spot she'd claimed for 37 years, since she and her late husband Thomas first moved to this tight-knit community. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore her best navy blue dress, the same one she'd worn to church functions for the past 3 years. Money had been tight, but Margaret believed in keeping up appearances, especially in God's house. Margaret clutched her worn prayer book, its pages yellowed with age and marked with decades of Sunday mornings. The book had belonged to her mother, and before that, her grandmother. It was one of the few valuable things she had left from better times. Her fingers traced the familiar cover as she listened to the organ music that filled the sanctuary. At 68 years old, Margaret had become something of a church pillar. When the Ladies' Auxiliary needed someone to organize the annual bake sale, they called Margaret. When families in the community faced hard times, Margaret was the first to show up with a casserole and a listening ear. She tended the small garden behind the church, growing vegetables that she donated to the local food bank. Her hands, weathered from years of farm work, still moved with purpose, whether she was arranging flowers for the altar or scrubbing dishes after church suppers. But Margaret carried a heavy secret that Sunday morning. Hidden beneath her composed exterior was a growing weight of worry that had been eating at her for months. The ranch she and Thomas had built together over 4 decades was slipping away from her, piece by piece, payment by payment. 5 years earlier, Thomas had been diagnosed with lung cancer. He'd been a smoker in his younger days, back when nobody talked about the dangers. The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt on a clear day. Margaret remembered sitting in that sterile doctor's office, holding Thomas's calloused hand while the physician explained treatment options and survival rates. The words seemed to echo from far away. They'd fought the cancer with everything they had. Thomas endured months of chemotherapy that left him weak and nauseated. Margaret drove him to appointments in the city, sometimes 3 times a week, watching their savings account shrink with each trip. The medical bills piled up like snow in a Montana winter, relentless and impossible to ignore. Their health insurance covered some costs, but not nearly enough. Experimental treatments, specialized medications, and travel expenses for second opinions drained their retirement fund. Margaret sold her mother's jewelry, then her grandmother's china set. She even parted with Thomas's vintage truck collection, vehicles he'd restored with loving care over the years. Thomas passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, with Margaret holding his hand and whispering prayers. The funeral filled St. Mary's to capacity. Ranchers, shopkeepers, teachers, and farmers came to pay their respects to a man who'd helped build the community. Thomas had been the kind of neighbor who'd drop everything to help a friend fix a broken fence or search for lost cattle. After the funeral expenses and final medical bills, Margaret discovered she was essentially broke. The ranch that had once been their pride and joy now felt like an anchor dragging her underwater. Property taxes alone amounted to $4,800 annually, money she simply didn't have. Margaret's monthly Social Security check barely covered her basic needs. Groceries, utilities, medication for her blood pressure, and fuel for her old pickup truck consumed every penny. She'd applied for assistance programs, but the paperwork was confusing, and her pride made it difficult to ask for help. This was the same woman who'd spent decades helping others. Accepting charity felt wrong somehow. 3 months ago, she'd received the first notice about overdue property taxes. The envelope had arrived on a Thursday, and Margaret stared at it for hours before finding the courage to open it. The official language was intimidating, full of legal terms she didn't understand. But the bottom line was clear: pay the taxes or face consequences. Margaret had immediately called the county assessor's office. She spoke with a clerk named Betty, who'd been sympathetic and helpful. Betty explained that payment plans were possible. and helped Margaret set up an arrangement to pay $100 monthly until the debt was cleared. It wasn't much, but it was what Margaret could manage while still covering her basic expenses for 2 months. Margaret faithfully made her payments. She'd drive to the courthouse on the 5th/10th of each month, clutch her small envelope with the payment, and hand it to Betty with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Betty always treated her kindly, never making her feel like a burden or a failure, but everything changed when Bradley Hutchins arrived in town. The new county tax collector came from back east, bringing big city attitudes to small-town problems. Hutchins had ideas about efficiency and making examples of people who couldn't pay their full obligations on time. He looked at Margaret's file and saw only numbers, not a grieving widow trying to keep her family home. Last week, Margaret had received a certified letter that made her hands shake as she read it. The payment plan was canceled. Full payment was demanded immediately. If she couldn't pay, legal action would follow. The letter was signed by Hutchins in bold, aggressive handwriting that seemed to leap off the page. Margaret had called the courthouse again, hoping to speak with Betty, but was told Betty no longer handled tax matters. Instead, she was transferred to Hutchins's office. The conversation was brief and cold. Payment plans were no longer available. The debt must be settled in full within 10 days, or enforcement action would begin. Margaret had spent sleepless nights wondering what enforcement action meant. Would they seize her property? Could they force her to sell the ranch Thomas had worked so hard to build? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing the truth. This Sunday morning, as she sat in her familiar pew listening to the organ prelude, Margaret tried to find peace in prayer. She closed her eyes and asked God for guidance, for strength, for some kind of miracle that would let her keep the home she'd shared with Thomas for so many years. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was praying for financial relief while sitting in a church where she'd given countless hours of volunteer service. She'd helped raise funds for new carpeting, organized dinners to pay for roof repairs, and contributed what she could to every collection plate. Now she was the one who needed help, and the humiliation burned in her chest. Margaret opened her eyes as Pastor Williams approached the pulpit. Around her, familiar faces settled into comfortable positions for the morning sermon. The Johnson family with their 3 young children, old Pete Morrison, Jake's father, who'd been coming to this church longer than anyone could remember. The Murphy sisters, twins who ran the local bakery and never missed a Sunday service. These were her people, her community, her chosen family since Thomas passed away. They had no idea about her financial struggles, her sleepless nights, or her fear of losing everything. Margaret had become skilled at wearing a mask of contentment, at deflecting questions about how she was managing with cheerful responses about keeping busy and trusting in God's plan. As the sermon began, Margaret tried to focus on Pastor Williams's words about faith and perseverance, but her mind kept drifting to the certified letter hidden in her kitchen drawer, to the impossible debt that hung over her head like a storm cloud, and to the growing certainty that her peaceful Sunday mornings in this beloved sanctuary might soon come to an end. Pastor Williams had just begun his sermon about loving your neighbor when the heavy wooden doors at the back of St. Mary's creaked open. The sound wasn't unusual. Latecomers often slipped in quietly during the opening minutes of service. But something about this entrance felt different. The footsteps were heavier, more deliberate, and they didn't stop at the back pews like most tardy churchgoers. Margaret noticed the shift in atmosphere before she saw who had entered. A few people in the back rows turned their heads slightly, and she caught Mrs. Patterson's eyes widening with concern. The elderly woman's expression made Margaret's stomach tighten with an unexplained dread. 2 men in brown uniforms walked slowly down the center aisle. Deputy Miller, the younger of the 2, looked uncomfortable as his boots clicked against the worn wooden floor. He was new to the county, having moved from a bigger city where serving legal papers was routine business. But this felt wrong to him, interrupting a church service to arrest an elderly woman for what amounted to unpaid bills. Behind him walked Deputy Carson, a veteran officer who'd been with the sheriff's department for 15 years. Carson had grown up in Cedar Ridge and knew Margaret by reputation. He'd eaten meals she'd prepared for community events and had seen her volunteer countless hours for local causes. But orders were orders, and Bradley Hutchins had been very specific about making this arrest public and immediate. The deputies carried official papers folded neatly in their shirt pockets, along with handcuffs that felt heavier than usual on their duty belts. Hutchins had insisted on the arrest warrant, claiming that Margaret Hayes had violated the terms of her payment agreement and was now officially in contempt of tax obligations. He wanted to send a clear message to other delinquent taxpayers in the county. Pastor Williams paused mid-sentence as he noticed the uniformed men approaching the front of the church. His sermon about compassion and community support suddenly felt prophetic. The congregation grew restless, whispers beginning to ripple through the sanctuary like wind through wheat fields. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the deputies stopped at her pew. She looked up at Deputy Miller's young face and saw something that might have been sympathy in his eyes. For a wild moment she hoped they were there for someone else, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. "Ma'am, are you Margaret Hayes?" Deputy Miller asked quietly, trying to maintain some dignity in the sacred space. Margaret's mouth went dry. Her prayer book slipped from her trembling fingers and landed on the floor, with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the now silent church. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we have a warrant for your arrest," Miller continued, his voice strained. "It's regarding unpaid property taxes. We need you to come with us." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She felt dizzy and gripped the edge of the wooden pew to steady herself. Around her, she could hear sharp intakes of breath and muffled gasps from her fellow churchgoers. Children began asking their parents what was happening in those loud whispers that only children can manage. "But I've been making payments," Margaret protested, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "I spoke with Betty at the courthouse. We had an arrangement. I've been paying what I can every month." Deputy Carson stepped forward, his expression harder than his partner's. "Ma'am, that arrangement has been canceled. The county requires full payment immediately, and since you can't provide that, we have to take you into custody." Pastor Williams abandoned his pulpit and hurried down to Margaret's pew. His face was flushed with indignation, and his usually calm demeanor showed cracks of anger. "Officers, surely this can wait until after the service. Mrs. Hayes is one of our most devoted members. There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Pastor," Carson replied firmly. "We have our orders. This needs to happen now." The congregation watched in stunned silence as their beloved Margaret struggled to stand. Her legs felt weak, and she had to use the pew for support. Mrs. Patterson reached out to steady her, tears already streaming down the older woman's cheeks. The two women had been friends for decades, sharing recipes, gardening tips, and the joys and sorrows of small-town life. "This is outrageous," whispered Mr. Johnson to his wife, pulling their youngest child closer. "Margaret Hayes has done more for this community than most people do in a lifetime." Deputy Miller looked around at the faces staring at him, faces filled with shock, anger, and disappointment. These weren't the expressions of people watching justice being served. These were the faces of a community watching one of their own being humiliated and degraded. His training had never prepared him for arresting grandmothers in church. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller said softly, hoping somehow to minimize the embarrassment of what came next. Margaret's face crumpled as the reality of the situation hit her fully. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "not here. Not in front of everyone. Can't we go outside?" Carson shook his head. "Ma'am, we need to secure you before we move. It's procedure." The metallic click of handcuffs opening seemed impossibly loud in the quiet sanctuary. Margaret had never been arrested for anything in her entire life. She'd never even received a speeding ticket. The cold metal against her wrists felt foreign and shameful, like wearing a scarlet letter for everyone to see. Young Billy Murphy, sitting with his grandmother, began to cry. He'd never seen anyone arrested before, and the sight of kind Mrs. Hayes in handcuffs was terrifying to his 8-year-old mind. His grandmother pulled him close, whispering reassurances while her own eyes filled with angry tears. The handcuffs clicked shut, and Margaret felt a piece of her dignity die. She'd held her head high through Thomas's illness, through financial ruin, through the loneliness of widowhood. But this public humiliation in the place she considered most sacred was almost unbearable. "Officers, please," Pastor Williams tried again. "Mrs. Hayes has been making payments. Surely we can work something out. The church could help with the remaining balance." "That's not our decision to make, Pastor," Carson replied. "We just enforce the warrants we're given." As the deputies prepared to escort Margaret from the church, she looked around at the faces of people who'd been her second family for nearly 4 decades. She saw shock, anger, and heartbreak reflected in their eyes. Mrs. Patterson was openly weeping now, and several of the men looked ready to intervene physically. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered to the congregation, though she had nothing to apologize for. "I'm so sorry for this disruption." The Murphy twins, who ran the local bakery, stood up in their pew. "This is wrong," one of them called out. "Margaret Hayes is the most honest person in this county." Other voices began to join in, creating a crescendo of protest and support, but the deputies remained unmoved. They had their orders, and they intended to carry them out regardless of community sentiment. As they began to walk Margaret toward the back of the church, her legs nearly gave out. The shame was overwhelming. She'd been baptized in this church, married here, mourned her husband here. Now she was being led away in handcuffs like a common criminal. The walk down that center aisle felt endless. Every step echoed with the weight of humiliation and injustice. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gazes of people she'd known and loved for decades. Behind her, she could hear Pastor Williams's voice rising above the murmur of the congregation. "Let us pray for our sister Margaret, and for wisdom and compassion from our community leaders." But prayers felt far away as Margaret approached those heavy wooden doors that had welcomed her faithfully every Sunday for 37 years. Today they would close behind her as she left in disgrace, uncertain if she'd ever have the courage to return. The deputies had just reached the back of the church with Margaret between them when the heavy oak doors suddenly burst open with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the sanctuary like thunder, causing everyone to jump in their seats. The doors slammed against the walls so hard that dust fell from the old wooden frame, and for a moment, the entire church fell into complete silence. Jake Morrison filled the doorway like a force of nature. At 52 years old, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broadened by decades of ranch work. His weathered cowboy hat cast a shadow over eyes that burned with barely controlled fury. He wore his Sunday clothes, a clean white shirt, dark jeans, and polished boots, but there was nothing peaceful about his presence. Jake had been driving his pickup truck past the church on his way to check on some cattle in the north pasture, when he'd spotted the patrol cars parked outside. Something about the scene had struck him as wrong. St. Mary's was a place of peace and worship, not somewhere you'd expect to see law enforcement on a Sunday morning. Curious and concerned, Jake had pulled over and walked close enough to peer through one of the tall windows. What he saw inside made his blood boil. Margaret Hayes, a woman he'd known and respected for years, was standing in handcuffs, while 2 deputies prepared to march her out of the church like a common criminal. Jake knew Margaret's story well. Everyone in the county did. She and Thomas had been good people, honest ranchers who'd worked hard their entire lives. When Thomas got sick, Jake had watched from a distance as the couple struggled with medical bills and the slow decline of their savings. After Thomas died, Jake had made a mental note to check on Margaret, but like many busy ranchers, he'd let good intentions slip away in the demands of daily life. Now, seeing her humiliated in front of the entire congregation, Jake felt a crushing weight of guilt mixed with righteous anger. This was exactly the kind of situation where neighbors should have stepped in sooner. This was what happened when communities let bureaucrats from outside make decisions about local people. The deputies froze as Jake's imposing figure blocked their path to the exit. Deputy Miller, already uncomfortable with the situation, felt his heart rate spike. He'd heard stories about Jake Morrison, how the rancher had once faced down 3 armed rustlers single-handedly, how he'd pulled a family from a burning car on the interstate, how he'd never backed down from a fight when he believed he was right. "What in the hell is going on here?" Jake's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Though he kept his tone controlled, everyone in the church could hear the dangerous edge underneath. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but there was a coiled tension in his stance that suggested he was ready for whatever came next. Deputy Carson, trying to maintain his authority, stepped forward. "Sir, we're conducting official business. Please step aside and let us pass." Jake didn't move an inch. Instead, he looked past the deputies to Margaret, seeing the tears on her cheeks and the shame in her eyes. It was a sight that hit him harder than any physical blow could have. This was a woman who'd baked pies for church fundraisers, who'd organized food drives for struggling families, who'd sat with sick neighbors through long nights when their own families couldn't be there. "Official business?" Jake's voice rose slightly. "You mean arresting a widow in church for being poor? That's what passes for official business now." The congregation began to murmur with approval. Jake Morrison might keep to himself most of the time, but when he spoke, people listened. He was one of the largest landowners in the county, employed dozens of local people, and had a reputation for fairness that stretched back to his father's generation. Margaret looked up at Jake with a mixture of gratitude and mortification. She'd always been proud of her independence, had never wanted to be seen as someone who needed rescuing. But right now, with cold metal around her wrists and the weight of public humiliation crushing down on her, Jake's presence felt like answered prayer. "Sir, this woman owes back taxes," Deputy Carson explained, his voice wavering slightly. "We have a warrant for her arrest." "This is standard procedure." Jake's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Standard procedure? To drag a 68-year-old woman out of church in handcuffs? What kind of procedure is that?" Pastor Williams, emboldened by Jake's presence, stepped forward again. "Mr. Morrison is right, officers. This is completely unnecessary. Mrs. Hayes was making payments on her taxes. She's not a flight risk or a danger to anyone." Jake's eyes fixed on Deputy Miller, the younger officer who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Son, do you have a grandmother?" Miller nodded reluctantly. "How would you feel if someone handcuffed her in church and paraded her out in front of everyone she knows? Would you call that justice?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Miller looked down at his boots, unable to meet Jake's steady gaze. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he became a deputy. He'd wanted to help people, to make communities safer. Arresting grandmothers for unpaid bills didn't feel like protecting and serving. Jake turned his attention to the congregation, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the sanctuary. "How much does she owe?" Deputy Carson checked his paperwork. $4,800 in back taxes. Without hesitation, Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. The leather cover was worn from years of use, marked with the scuffs and stains of ranch life. He'd written checks for cattle purchases, equipment repairs, and employee bonuses, but never had a check felt more important than this one. "I'll pay it," Jake announced simply, as if he were offering to buy coffee for a friend. The church erupted. In surprised gasps and murmurs, Mrs. Patterson clasped her hands together and whispered, "Thank the Lord," under her breath. The Murphy twins exchanged amazed glances, while Pastor Williams felt his faith in human goodness restored, but Jake wasn't finished. He looked directly at both deputies, his expression hardening again. "I'll pay her debt, but only under one condition." The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the old church clock seemed loud as a drum. Everyone waited to hear what the rancher would demand. "You take those handcuffs off her right now, and you apologize to this entire congregation for this disgrace." Deputy Carson's face flushed red. "Sir, we can't just—" "You can and you will," Jake interrupted, stepping closer. The deputy suddenly felt very small next to the rancher's imposing frame. "This woman has done more good for this community than most people do in 3 lifetimes. Her husband served his country in Vietnam. She's volunteered at this church for decades, helped families through hard times, and never asked for anything in return." Jake's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "And you want to arrest her for being poor? For not being able to pay taxes after her husband's medical bills wiped them out?" What kind of men are you? Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. But for the first time since the deputies had approached her pew, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of gratitude and relief. Someone was standing up for her. Someone saw her worth beyond the numbers on a tax bill. The younger deputy, Miller, looked at his partner with pleading eyes. This whole situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had intended. The arrest was supposed to be quick and simple, but now they were facing down an angry rancher, a hostile congregation, and their own consciences. Jake opened his checkbook and clicked his pen with deliberate force. The sound seemed to echo through the church like a gavel falling. I'm writing this check right now, $4,800. But those handcuffs come off first, or I tear this check up and you can explain to your boss why you turned down full payment of the debt. The tension in St. Mary's Church was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jake Morrison stood with his checkbook open, pen poised over the paper, while the two deputies shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of angry stares. The congregation had gone from shocked silence to barely contained outrage, and everyone could feel that this moment would define what kind of community Cedar Ridge really was. Deputy Miller was the first to crack under the pressure. At 26 years old, he joined law enforcement because he wanted to help people and make a difference. But looking at Margaret Hayes standing there in handcuffs, her dignity stripped away in front of people who'd known her for decades, he felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't justice. This was cruelty disguised as procedure. Carson, Miller whispered to his partner, maybe we should consider the rancher's offer. The debt gets paid either way, right? But Deputy Carson was a different breed altogether. He'd been with the sheriff's department for 15 years and had developed a rigid view of law enforcement that left no room for flexibility or compassion. In his mind, orders were orders, regardless of circumstances. Bradley Hutchins had specifically instructed them to make this arrest public and complete it fully, and Carson intended to follow those instructions to the letter. We're not negotiating with civilians, Carson said loudly enough for everyone to hear. This woman is under arrest, and she's coming with us whether someone pays her debt or not. That's how the law works. Jake's jaw tightened at Carson's words. The rancher had spent his entire adult life building something meaningful in this community. He employed 37 people directly on his ranch, supported local businesses, and had quietly helped countless families through hard times without seeking recognition. He understood how things really worked in small towns, and he knew that sometimes doing the right thing meant bending the rules. The law? Jake's voice rose, and for the first time, real anger crept into his tone. Let me tell you something about the law, Deputy. The law is supposed to protect people like Margaret, not humiliate them. The law is supposed to serve justice, not satisfy some bureaucrat's ego. The congregation began to murmur agreement, and several people nodded their heads vigorously. Old Pete Morrison, Jake's 78-year-old father, struggled to his feet from his usual pew near the back. Despite his age and arthritis, Pete's voice carried clearly through the church. My boy's right, Pete called out, his weathered face set with determination. I've lived in this county for 80 years, and I've never seen anything so shameful. Margaret Hayes is worth 10 of that pencil-pushing tax collector. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly weeping, suddenly found her voice. Margaret brought meals to my family when my husband was in the hospital. She sat with me through 3 nights when we didn't know if he'd pull through. She's never asked for anything in return, not once. Her words seemed to unlock something in the rest of the congregation. One by one, people began to stand and share their own stories about Margaret's kindness and generosity. She organized the fundraiser when the Williams family lost their home in that fire, called out Betty Chun, who ran the local diner. She taught Sunday school for 20 years, added Robert Hayes, no relation but someone who'd watched Margaret. Mentored dozens of children over the decades. She grows vegetables in the church garden and gives them all away to families who need food, said young mother Lisa Thompson, bouncing her toddler on her hip. Jake listened to each testimonial, his expression growing more determined with every word. This wasn't just about paying a tax debt anymore. This was about defending the very soul of their community against outside forces that didn't understand or care about the bonds that held small towns together. "You hear that, Deputy?" Jake said, turning back to Carson. "You're trying to arrest the heart and soul of this community. This woman has given more to Cedar Ridge than most people give in 10 lifetimes. And you want to drag her away in chains because she can't afford to pay taxes after watching her husband die of cancer." Carson remained unmoved, but Jake could see uncertainty creeping into his partner's eyes. Miller kept glancing between Margaret's tear-stained face and the angry congregation, clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the world. Jake took a step closer to both deputies, his imposing frame casting a shadow over them. "I'll tell you what's going to happen here. I'm going to write this check for $4,800. You're going to take those handcuffs off Margaret right now. And then you're going to apologize to her and everyone in this church for this disgraceful display. And if we don't?" Carson challenged, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Jake's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then I make some phone calls. I've got the sheriff's personal number, the county commissioner's home phone, and the state representative on speed dial. I employ enough people in this county that when I talk, politicians listen. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper within 200 miles will know that Cedar Ridge deputies arrested a 68-year-old widow in church for the crime of being poor." The threat hit Carson like a physical blow. Jake Morrison wasn't just some angry rancher making empty threats. He was one of the most influential men in the county, with connections that reached all the way to the state capitol. If he decided to make this arrest a public relations nightmare, he had the resources and credibility to do exactly that. Pastor Williams stepped forward, sensing the moment was ripe for intervention. "Deputies, I've been the minister of this church for 12 years. In all that time, I've never seen anyone more deserving of our community's protection than Margaret Hayes. She embodies everything we try to teach about Christian charity and neighbor helping neighbor." Jake nodded at the pastor's words, then looked directly at Margaret. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the handcuffs and the public humiliation, she stood with quiet dignity that reminded everyone why they loved and respected her so much. "Margaret," Jake said softly, "Thomas was a good man. He helped me when I was just starting out, gave me advice about ranching that probably saved me from bankruptcy my first year. He'd be proud of how you've carried on, and he sure wouldn't want to see you treated like this." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the silent church. "Jake, I can't ask you to pay my debts. It's too much money, and it wouldn't be right." "You're not asking," Jake replied firmly. "I'm offering. And it's not charity. It's what neighbors do for each other. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I'm not doing this just for you. I'm doing it because I'll be damned if I let some outside bureaucrat turn our community into a place where we arrest grandmothers in church." Deputy Miller finally found his courage. He'd been silent through most of the confrontation, but watching this incredible display of community solidarity had touched something deep inside him. This was what he'd imagined police work could be about: bringing people together, solving problems, making communities stronger. "Carson," Miller said quietly to his partner, "we should take the rancher's offer. The debt gets paid, nobody gets hurt, and we all go home. Isn't that what really matters?" But Carson's pride was on the line now. He'd made his position clear in front of the entire congregation, and backing down would feel like surrender. "We have our orders, Miller. We're taking her in, check or no check." The church fell silent again as everyone processed Carson's stubbornness. Jake's hand tightened around his pen, and for a moment it looked like he might actually tear up the check he'd been preparing to write. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He began to write the check anyway, speaking as his pen moved across the paper. $4,800, he said clearly, made out to Cedar Ridge County Tax Department. Paid in full for the property taxes of Margaret Hayes. He held up the completed check for everyone to see, then looked directly at both deputies. "There, the debt is paid. Now you have exactly two choices, gentlemen. You can remove those handcuffs and walk away with your dignity intact, or you can try to arrest a woman whose debt has been satisfied in full, in front of 50 witnesses who will testify that you refused payment and chose to pursue a vindictive arrest instead." The silence in St. Mary's Church stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Jake Morrison held the completed check in his weathered hand, while 50 pairs of eyes watched Deputy Carson's face for any sign of what would happen next. The deputy's jaw worked silently as he struggled between his stubborn pride and the growing realization that he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. "Deputy." Miller stepped forward before his partner could respond. The young officer had reached his breaking point watching this community rally around one of their own while he enforced what felt more like persecution than justice. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the keys to Margaret's handcuffs. That's enough," Miller said quietly. "The debt's been paid. This is over." Carson spun toward his partner, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Miller, what do you think you're doing?" "We have our orders." "Our orders were to collect back taxes." "Or make an arrest," Miller replied, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Well, the taxes are collected. The check's right there. Our job is done." The metallic click of the handcuffs opening seemed to echo through the entire sanctuary. Margaret's wrists were red and sore where the metal had pressed against her skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional relief flooding through her body. She rubbed her wrists gently. Still hardly believing that this nightmare was finally ending, Jake stepped forward and placed the check directly into Deputy Carson's reluctant hands. "There's your $4,800, paid in full. Now, I believe you owe this lady and this congregation an apology." Carson stared down at the check, seeing his own reflection in Jake's bold handwriting. The amount was more than he made in 2 months, casually written out by a man who decided that justice was worth more than money. For the first time since entering the church, Carson began to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. Carson started, then stopped. The words stuck in his throat like sawdust. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that had transformed from shock to anger to something approaching pity. These weren't hostile strangers judging him. These were decent people who were disappointed in him, which somehow felt worse than outright hatred. Margaret, despite everything she'd endured, found her voice first. "It's all right, Deputy," she said softly. "You were just doing your job." Her grace in that moment of triumph moved everyone in the church, but Jake wasn't ready to let the matter rest. "No, Margaret, it's not all right. What happened here today should never happen to anyone, anywhere. This wasn't about doing a job. This was about power and humiliation." Pastor Williams stepped beside Margaret, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "What Mr. Morrison is saying, officers, is that sometimes doing our job means remembering why we chose that job in the first place. Police work is supposed to protect and serve communities, not tear them apart." Deputy Miller nodded slowly, his young face showing the weight of a hard lesson learned. "You're right, Pastor. Mrs. Hayes, I'm truly sorry for what happened here today. This wasn't right, and it shouldn't have happened." The congregation murmured approval at Miller's words, but all eyes remained on Carson, waiting to see if the veteran deputy would follow his partner's lead. Carson looked around the church one more time, seeing the faces of people he'd grown up with, people whose respect he'd just lost through his stubborn adherence to orders that should never have been given. "Mrs. Hayes," Carson said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I owe you an apology. What we did here today was wrong. I'm sorry." Margaret nodded graciously, accepting the apology with the same dignity she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. But Jake wasn't finished with his mission to transform this moment of injustice into something meaningful for the entire community. "There's something else," Jake announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "What happened here today showed me something important. We've got neighbors in trouble, and we're not doing enough to help them. Too many people are struggling in silence, afraid to ask for help, afraid of being judged." He paused, looking around at the faces of people he'd known for decades but had never really talked to about their deepest struggles and fears. "I'm starting a fund right here, right now. The Margaret Hayes Community Support Fund. I'm putting in $50,000 of my own money to help families facing financial hardships. The announcement hit the congregation like lightning. Gasps and whispers rippled through the pews as people processed Jake's incredible generosity. $50,000 was more money than most families in Cedar Ridge saw in several years. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her arthritis making the movement difficult. "Count me in for whatever I can spare," she called out. "Margaret's been there for all of us. It's time we were there for each other." One by one, other voices joined in. The Murphy twins pledged profits from their bakery's monthly specials. Robert Hayes offered to donate his construction services for families needing home repairs. Betty Chun promised free meals for anyone going through medical crises. Margaret watched through tears as her community transformed her moment of greatest humiliation into something beautiful and powerful. The very public nature of her arrest, which had felt like the end of the world 30 minutes earlier, was now becoming the catalyst for unprecedented community support. Jake pulled out his phone and made a call right there in the church. Everyone could hear his side of the conversation as he spoke to someone at the county courthouse. "This is Jake Morrison. I want to speak to Bradley Hutchins immediately. I don't care if it's Sunday. Well, you tell him that if he's not in his office in 1 hour, I'll be calling the county commissioners to discuss his employment status." After ending the call, Jake addressed the congregation again. "Hutchins is going to hear exactly what I think about his methods, and I'm going to make sure new policies are put in place so this never happens to anyone else." Pastor Williams stepped back to his pulpit, his planned sermon forgotten in favor of addressing what had just transpired. "Brothers and sisters, we've witnessed something extraordinary here today. We've seen how quickly injustice can strike, but we've also seen how powerful a community can be when it stands together." He gestured toward Margaret, who was now surrounded by friends offering hugs and support. "Margaret, you came to church today carrying a burden you thought you had to bear alone. You're leaving here knowing that you have 50 families who consider your struggles their own." The pastor's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm. "And Jake, your generosity today reminds us all that when we have much, we're called to share with those who have little. You've turned what could have been a day of shame into a day of grace." As the service concluded, people didn't rush for the exits as they usually did. Instead, they gathered around Margaret, sharing stories, offering help, and making plans for the community fund that had been born from crisis. The Murphy twins invited her for dinner. Mrs. Patterson insisted on driving her home. 3 different families offered to help with grocery shopping and house maintenance. Deputy Miller approached Jake before leaving. "Mr. Morrison, what you did today, that took real courage. And your offer to help other families, that's going to change lives." Jake shook the young deputy's hand. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't complicated, son. It just requires us to remember that we're all in this together." As the crowd began to thin, Margaret found herself alone with Jake for a moment. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice still shaky with emotion. "You don't need to thank me, Margaret. Thomas helped me when I needed it, and now I'm helping you. That's how it's supposed to work." Jake smiled and adjusted his hat. "Besides, something tells me this community support fund is going to help a lot more people than just you." 6 months later, the Margaret Hayes Community Support Fund had grown to over $200,000 and had helped 43 families. Through various crises, Bradley Hutchins had been quietly transferred to a desk job in the state capitol, far from the daily lives of small-town residents. New county policies required social services consultation before any arrest of elderly or disabled citizens for nonviolent infractions. Margaret returned to her regular pew every Sunday, but now she sat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was truly valued by her community. The empty spot where she'd been handcuffed became an unofficial reminder to everyone about the importance of standing up for neighbors in need, and Jake Morrison, the rancher who'd always kept to himself, found himself running for county commissioner. 2 years later, on a platform of compassionate governance and community support, he won in a landslide, carrying every precinct in the county. The Sunday that had started with injustice and Humiliation had transformed into something that would strengthen Cedar Ridge for generations to come.